I want to thank you very much for letting me give my podcast this morning. It's going to be on the book of James and the book of Peter, number 1, number 2 in the New Testament, both written by Apostle Paul. In the New Testament, Paul wrote 14 of the books. Peter wrote 2, John wrote 3, and Jude wrote 1. And so we'll go ahead and get started, and we'll talk about the book of James. He was a pillar of a church. He was a minister, a deacon of the First Christianity Church in Jerusalem. And rumor has it that in 49 BC, he wrote the book of James. When you look at James, one of the original apostles, there's speculation of his blood relationship with Jesus, and through my research, I found out that his mother name is Mary. She was a sister of the Virgin Mary, so it would put him as a cousin to Jesus, not a direct brother. So it's a confusion there as you try to figure out who James was in relation to Jesus. He was called James the Great or James the Lesser, depends on which books of the Bible you read. And what's making it really important is that he witnessed the resurrection of Christ, and he would have known about being put on the cross, and he would have known and seen 3 days later he rose, including the upper room where Jesus came back in through locked doors and sat down with the 11/12 apostles. And James was the next person to be martyred or murdered after Jesus, and they figure at about 62 AD he was murdered by the Jews. And this book of James was written as a guide to people in Jerusalem, the Jews in Jerusalem, and is written as a guide and direct them in faith. And main thing about the faith is the whole law must follow Jesus, and if you violate one law, then you despise God. So we see some strong message here in on James. And as you read the book of James, chapter 2, verse 5, God has chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom, which is promised to those who love him. This is so important to understand why Jesus keeps picking on the poor to follow him, like the 12 apostles. They weren't rich, they were just common people. Because when you're poor, you look for faith in God to help. Rich, you just look at yourself. And verse 26, for as the body apart from spirit is dead, and also faith apart from works is dead. What this is saying is that the body has to have the soul, the spirit, guiding it. Otherwise, it's going to be led into passion or lust and sin in front of God. And then when you have faith in God and Jesus, you have to show that in helping the world and helping the poor around you. Chapter 3, verse 17, wisdom that you pick up is from above, not necessarily from books and people that you're learning from. God grants you spiritual wisdom. And the strength of prayer is book 5, verse 17, is Isaiah, and there's no rain for 3.5 years. Then he prayed again, and the rain fed the earth and bore fruit. And God listens to those who pray. And then that is what's, so the prayers that you give, God hears them, and then he responds accordingly. And so it becomes important to understand James and his role, and further research, especially around Christmas, it showed James, leaving Jerusalem and going to Madrid, Spain, and try to do his little recruiting churches and people to the word of Jesus, and he went back to Jerusalem to be murdered. And then now we'll go ahead and get into the strength of the New Testament, which is definitely Peter 1 and Peter 2, and he wrote these books basically in 23 AD, mainly for Asia Minor, or the 7 churches in southern Turkey. He had a brother called Andrew, and he was basically known as the Rock. And then in 67 AD, he was murdered in Rome, by the Romans. And he wrote both of these books for Asia Minor, to the acceptance of Christianity, separated from their own and countrymen, and he was abused and persecuted. In life, this is a beautiful saying, that life on earth is but a pilgrimage. That means that high and low, you're being challenged, and you have to keep your eyes on the sky and know that God, Jesus, is there. And then you will stand, we will stand in front of Jesus, and will be judged accordingly. Chapter 4, verse 6, the gospel is preached even to the dead, a reference to the good tidings Christ brought to the souls in limbo. This is way past my pay grade or your pay grade to understand about the dead still being judged, and which gets us into a couple passages from the Old Testament, and we'll look at one or two of them. The rich man and Lazarus, the 16th chapter, the book of Luke. Jesus tells a story, the unnamed rich man and the beggar Lazarus. Rich man goes to Hades and implores Abraham to send Lazarus from his bosom to warn the rich man's family. And the rich man is a physical man without spirit, and religion has no consideration for him. But afterlife, the soul can rest in hell, waiting for a judgment day and for Jesus. And so Jesus is here talking about the morality of the soul. And we can see a little bit more about the dead in the first book of Samuel, verse 28. King Saul, he went to a medium and wants to ask the medium to call up the prophet Samuel, because Saul fears attacks from the Philistines. And then Samuel, who's dead, says, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" So this is stuff that it's important for us to remember, that just because we die doesn't mean it's all over, because that's the immortality of the soul. In Peter, 1, he's referring to Babylon. When he says Babylon, that's the metaphor for Rome, probably founded on Jewish usage. And when we get into the last book in the New Testament, Revelations, they talk about the last days being in Babylon, which in this case, it's going to be, Rome. And the author, which is Peter, he often calls himself Simon Peter, a servant and apostle of Jesus Christ. He witnessed Lord Jesus' transfiguration, raising from the dead. And in the passages in the Peter 1, Peter 2, he knows death is coming. And then he was killed in 67 AD. And having escaped the corruption which is in the world by listening to the code of moral living as taught by Jesus Christ. And there again, he's talking about the dead being delivered to Tartarus, custody in hell, waiting judgment. Chapter 3, verse 7, the word that created the world and destroyed it by water, how now preserve the world for the general configuration at the end of time and day of judgment and destruction of the ungodly, men. And Peter 2, since I know that putting on my body will be soon, our Lord Jesus Christ has made it clear to me in chapter 3, verse 8. But do not overlook this one fact, beloved, that with the Lord 1 day is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is 1 day. When we look at God and when he moves, he's not looking at 1 day, because in his mind, how he acts, 1 day can be 1,000 years, or 1,000 years can be due 1 day. And that's how Jesus pretty well looked at things, because he didn't worry about destroying the Romans being nailed to the cross, because he knew that 70 A.D. or 67 years after he's being put up on the cross by the Jews, that Rome would be destroying Jerusalem. And he knew that by 300 years later, that Rome would be overthrown and dark ages would come to Europe. So he knew that Rome wouldn't last. He knew that the Jews in Jerusalem wouldn't last. And so he didn't look at about what's happening today. He could see down the road what's going to happen to them all. And chapter 3, verse 13, but according to his promise, we are waiting for the new heaven and the new earth in which righteousness would dwell. And this is basically getting into sayings in Jesus and Revelations that there will be a new heaven on earth, and it will last over 1,000 years, and with Jesus, ruling the quick and the dead. So I want to thank you very much for giving this podcast on the book of James and the book of Peter 1 and Peter 2. And please look at our webpage, especially now is really critical, because we're finally getting our grants off the ground, and then we'll go into in 2026 to 2029 about projects to get into, and that's going to be helping the poor in spirit, help the children, and there again it's going to be having faith, and then let that faith in the works that you're doing, which is the whole structure of our Romans. Please look at our webpage, romans7.org, and give us encouragement. I want to thank you very much for letting me give this broadcast. I want to say hello to my brother Bobby out there, the preacher, minister, Christ Comfort Ministries. Please look at his webpage and then give him encouragement too. So God bless. Thank you very much.